Hi, it's Katrina. It's going to get hot today as I show you some of the greatest mysteries buried in the desert. From a lost civilization to a mysterious oracle, let's jump right in. The Impossible Temple of Saudi Arabia. An impossible temple ruin has been discovered in Saudi Arabia. Archaeologists are saying it is 8,000 years old. This shocking find was made by the Saudi Heritage Commission just outside the capital of Riyadh. The multinational team used aerial photography, drone footage, topographic surveys, and ground-penetrating radar to look for any ruins hidden underneath the sand of the desert. They also used laser scans and land surveys, and had people actually go there and walk across the ground to see what they found. It was a major operation that led to this temple. At least, this is what it may have looked like in the ancient past. This is what it looks like today, thanks to the Saudi press agency. The ruins of this Neolithic temple complex are just barely poking out of the sand. There is the temple itself, equipped with a huge stone altar that was used in rituals that nobody has performed in 80 centuries. There are also homes which were part of the settlement surrounding the temple. And then there is the creepiest part, the 2,807 graves found sprawled in the nearby area. These amazing ruins are in the Empty Quarter, one of the most desolate places on the planet. It's called Al-Rub al-Khali in the local tongue. They have already become controversial because of the fact they challenge the idea of monotheism. Saudi Arabia is a predominantly Muslim country, yet that wasn't always the case. This ancient temple has inscriptions in it that prove the prehistoric people who lived here worshipped many gods. One of the inscriptions is addressed to the god Kahal, believed to have been a local deity. Long before Islam came to Arabia, there was a vastly different religion dominating the desert. The reason I called the temple impossible is that it's incredibly old, older than it has any right to be. It was found at the top of Tuwaik Mountain, which happens to be covered in Stone Age rock drawings. The petroglyphs here show hunting, traveling, and humans fighting. How are people who still drew petroglyphs building settlements and massive temples? They were way ahead of their time. The lost people of the Sahara. The inhospitable wasteland of the Sahara Desert was once home to a mighty kingdom whose name was almost completely forgotten. I don't know if you've seen the new Dune movie, but this civilization could have easily survived on the desert planet of Arrakis. They tapped into hidden groundwater, built cities, and defied the heat of the sun. But in the end, the civilization depleted their resources and went extinct. In 2023, a group of scientists announced some big new discoveries at the Geological Society of America's meeting. Frank Schwartz from Ohio State University said certain features allowed humanity to grow in the desert. By special features, Frank was talking about 6,000 years of monsoon rains. That'll help. Frank said that from 11,000 to 5,000 years ago, there were annual downpours in the Sahara. The frequent and dependable water created a habitable environment. Forget sand dunes and sand rash, which sounds incredibly uncomfortable. The Sahara used to be a tropical paradise. There were all kinds of animals, and there were a lot of different groups of prehistoric people. It was like the Amazon rainforest, only a little less wet and a little less full of venomous snakes. The Green Party ended 5,000 years ago. All data shows that the monsoon stopped and the Sahara turned back into being a lonely desert. Every civilization retreated, except for one. Drum roll, please. This one civilization called themselves the Garamantes. Their prehistoric ancestors refused to leave the desert, even as things got more and more brutal. By 400 BC, the Garamantes had formed a modern empire in the Libyan desert. They lasted for about 800 years, only vanishing in 400 AD. They even managed to avoid getting beat up by the Romans. Frank Schwartz believes he and his team have uncovered the secret to the Garamantes' survival. The ancient desert dwellers may have had access to one of the biggest aquifers on the planet. They figured out how to dig into the side of a hill underneath the water table, thereby allowing water to spill out from an artificial tunnel into an irrigation system. They didn't just know how to do it, they perfected it. In Libya, archaeologists have uncovered nearly 500 miles of underground tunnels and access shafts used to harvest groundwater. These people were hydrogeologic geniuses. But this is where things take a dark turn. Being geniuses was great until suddenly it wasn't. The Garamantes drained one of the biggest water aquifers ever found in a desert. By 400, their aquifers had gone dry. The whole empire collapsed in a single generation because nobody had anything to drink. As you know, water is life. And now for number 9, but first, it's shout-out time! I want to give a big thank you to Sean Luke Hamilton for the super thanks. It really means a lot. If you are new here, be sure to subscribe to join the Origins Explained family. The fabled Oracle of Amun. Moving from one desert to the next, our next stop is the Siwa Oasis, home to the ancient Oracle of Amun. This paradise in the middle of Egypt's Great Sand Sea doesn't have much to do with its pyramids or its vast valleys of tombs. It's a mystical place, one that not many people get the privilege of ever seeing. In the center of Siwa Oasis is the crumbling old town, an ancient relic of the past that nobody lives in anymore. Down the street is the Mountain of the Dead, an actual mountain of sand-colored dirt pockmarked with graves like a huge communal termite nest. This mountain of doomed souls witnessed countless travelers over the years perish in their attempt to reach the oasis. Siwa is hard enough to get to now in the modern age, but thousands of years in the past, it was next to impossible. The few people who managed to brave the trip through the desert felt that they had just completed an epic mission. Their reward was, depending on their status, a visit to the legendary oracle. Maybe you've heard of the Oracle of Delphi, the priestess who lived at the Temple of Apollo in Greece. Her prophecies were taken so seriously that kings would visit her before making any major decisions. Before going to war, for example, a king would seek the oracle for her opinion and for a possible glimpse into the future. The oracle at the Siwa Oasis was the same. She was housed inside the Grand Temple of Amun starting around the 7th century BC. It didn't take long before she was one of the most popular women in the desert. She was one of the 7 holy oracles and the only one not in Greece. Several of the most important men in human history made the journey to the oracle's temple. Men like King Cambyses of Persia in 525 BC. He went to the oracle expecting her to legitimize his conquest of Egypt. When she refused, he was furious. King Cambyses returned to Luxor, then ordered 50,000 soldiers to march across the desert and destroy the oasis. They were to enslave the whole population, oracle included. These soldiers never made it. Legend has it all 50,000 of them lost their bearings somewhere in the desert and died. Not a single one of their bones has ever been found. Losing an army of this size in the ancient world was a pretty big deal. I'm sure Cambyses took it that the gods were not on his side. Next was Alexander of Macedon, the man you may know as Alexander the Great. Before his conquest of Egypt 200 years after Cambyses, Alexander knew he needed to pay his respects to the oracle. First, he sent a delegation to the Siwa Oasis, letting the oracle know the situation. After he founded the city of Alexandria, he went to the Temple of Amun personally, unannounced, in 331 BC. This must have been the greatest day of Alexander's life. In the holiest temple in Egypt, in the presence of the holiest oracle outside Greece, he was declared the son of Amun. The oracle essentially turned Alexander into a god-king. For the Greeks, Amun was the equivalent of Zeus, so Alexander was on the same level as Hercules. There is a real possibility that after Alexander's death, he was taken to Siwa to be buried. If you're a fan of the channel, you've likely heard me talk about Alexander's missing tomb before. Some think it's in Macedonia, others think Greece. Most say it's in Egypt, yet nobody can find it. Archaeologist Liana Zuvaltzi claimed that Alexander's tomb is somewhere underneath the timeless oasis. What do you think? The evolution of the nomad warriors. In China's Turpan Basin, archaeologists recently uncovered a very important piece of treasure about 2,700 years old. It's not the kind of treasure that Indiana Jones would start an adventure trying to find. This relic is a simple leather saddle, yet its history is fascinating, connecting ancient Chinese nomads with the Scythian warlords of Russia's Altai Mountains. Did you know that horseback riding began in Central Asia about 3,000 years ago? That would make this saddle one of the oldest in the world, one of the first ever made by human hands. But what was it doing in a random woman's grave in the middle of the desert? China's Turpan Basin is a miserable place. 19,000 square miles of dry, arid death. Yet it's also home to Turpan, which had been one of the most important cities on the Silk Road. Now the city is deserted, the Silk Road a thing of the past. Nestled in a depression, Turpan has been called the lowest, hottest, and driest ruin in China, maybe the world. Patrick Vertman from the University of Zurich said the woman likely belonged to the Subeishi culture. At her time of burial, she was dressed in woolen pants, leather boots, and a hide coat. She kind of looked like a hardcore biker. With the addition of this saddle to her grave goods, it's safe to say she was a professional rider. She might have even been a bloodthirsty warrior. This leads me to the Scythians, history's most lovable nomads. The Greeks called them the Amazons, telling stories of savage warrior women who could easily best even the strongest Spartan fighters. The ancient tales of the Scythians are responsible for Wonder Woman. I can't overstate how important the Scythians were to history, cruising across the steppes of Central Asia and Russia on horseback. But here's the crazy thing. The oldest known Scythian saddle is 200 years younger than the saddle found in China. It's possible the mysterious woman from the Subeishi culture, buried in the Turpan wasteland, was a horse lord even before the Scythians. Morocco's hidden gem. Ouarzazate is the craziest place you've never heard of. Even the name is weird. It's known as the Door of the Desert, an epic city of sand located near the Atlas Mountains in Morocco. The city has a unique ancient atmosphere to it, so much so that it's become one of the most popular filmmaking destinations in Africa. The movies that have been made here include The Mummy, Gladiator, and some episodes of Game of Thrones. It's easy to walk through Ouarzazate's streets and feel as if you've been transported to another world. In the Middle Ages, merchants moving from other parts of Africa across northern Morocco and into Europe stopped in Ouarzazate to rest. The city is home to some seriously ancient pieces of architecture, like the Ait Ben Haddou. During the days of caravan travel between the Sahara and Marrakesh, Ait Ben Haddou operated as a fortified village. It's been standing since the 11th century, although not all its pieces are original. Most of the fortified village was rebuilt in the 17th century. Still, if you want to see a caravan city and see where dozens of the most famous movies have been shot, Ouarzazate is the place to visit. The Temple of Lord Shiva. An incredible temple dedicated to the Hindu god Shiva was recently discovered buried in sand by a group of villagers. It was all thanks to the COVID-19 lockdown and too much boredom. In India and the Pradesh Nellore district, a group of villagers had absolutely nothing to do during the lockdown in 2020. Instead of sitting around, they decided to search for a lost temple their elders had been telling them about for years. In 1850, the Perumalapadu village was flooded. The whole place was submerged, causing the villagers to relocate to higher elevation. Their old village became completely buried underneath an accumulation of sand dunes. One of the lost buildings was a historic temple built 300 years ago. Amazingly, the villagers found it. They managed to reveal the face of the temple. Take a look for yourself. This picture is from Asia News International. It shows the face of the ancient temple barely sticking out of the sand. It's so effectively buried that it's hard to tell the temple apart from the physical sand dune. Before the locals could clear out the rest of the temple, they were stopped by local authorities. There's too much danger of accidentally damaging the structure or causing a deadly sandslide. Now the villagers are waiting for archaeologists to carry out a full investigation, possibly revealing more of the lost village's temples. Negev desert trafficking. Let's do some tomb raiding for a minute in Israel's Negev desert. In 2021, archaeologists with the IAA found something seriously unexpected. The discovery of some human bones led to a majorly controversial discussion surrounding sacred prostitutes. It all began, as these things so often do, with a bit of road work. Along the path of a new waterline, workers found piles of stones that looked like burial markers. Archaeologists came to excavate, unearthing a pair of deep burial tombs. The tombs are 2,500 years old. They were also filled with the skeletal remains of women. When it comes to ancient tombs, men didn't have a monopoly, but it was close. Researchers were shocked not to find a single male bone. Even though there were only 2 tombs, there were more than 50 bodies found in the largest chamber alone, plus even more in the smaller chamber. During excavations, archaeologists kept finding skeletons haphazardly arranged, thrown one on top of the other. It was as if they'd been shoved in the chambers with complete disregard for proper burial practices. The tombs were also full of goods, things like shells, jewelry, and valuable objects from the 5th century BC. One of the coolest artifacts found was of Egyptian origin. Check out this amulet from the IAA. I know it's a little old and worn, but it's still awesome. It depicts Bes, the Egyptian god of protecting women and children. There is no way an amulet of Bes found in a chamber filled with nothing but the skeletons of women is a coincidence. Bes was the protector of women to the Egyptians. There was definitely something strange going on here. One of the things that really confused archaeologists was the lack of any nearby settlements. The Negev desert is harsh and inhospitable, not a great place to build a city. The tombs were carved into the desert floor far from civilization, meaning they likely weren't connected to one specific community. The tombs have an almost secretive vibe to them, as if those buried in their chambers were outcasts with no home. The more archaeologists investigated the tombs, the more they realized they had stumbled upon a tragic piece of history. It's now believed the tombs were reserved for slaves who died while being transported across the desert and sold as prostitutes. It's grim, horrible, but a real piece of history. Ancient texts tell us that in the 1st millennium BC, slave women were purchased in Gaza or Egypt and then trafficked across the Negev desert to Arabia. Once in Arabia, they were sold into sacred prostitution rings operated by a variety of bizarre religious groups. Keep in mind this was more than 1,000 years before Islam. Arabia was a place of many gods and traditions. Sacred prostitution is something you don't hear about much these days, but in the ancient world, in Babylon, Arabia, Sumer, Phoenicia, and even Greece, sacred prostitution was a big deal. I won't get into any explicit details, but I can give you a rough idea of why it was so important in ancient cultures. Women, usually slaves, were paid to engage in certain acts with men as part of either religious worship, fertility rituals, or divine marriage. There is so little known about the custom that even in the academic world, the subject is touchy and controversial. When France tried to turn the Sahara into a sea. The story you're about to hear is so fanciful you might not believe it, but trust me, it's true. In France, near the end of the 19th century, there was a man named Ferdinand de Lesseps. He was something of a rock star before rock stars even existed. Ferdinand was the man who created the Suez Canal, which finished in 1869. He turned Africa into an island. He saved sailors 4,000 miles on their voyages from Europe to Asia. The Suez Canal was a big deal in the history of merchant sailing. Having changed the world, Ferdinand needed something new to do. He needed another great project that would earn him even more wealth and fame. He decided he was going to kill the North African desert. How does one go about killing a desert? Ferdinand was going to turn the Sahara into a vast inland sea. But it wasn't all his idea. The original proposal came from François-Élie Roudaire, a French army captain. In 1864, François mapped some of the most remote parts of Algeria, which at the time was a French colony. François wasn't just an army captain. He was also a brilliant military geographer. He realized that the desert along the border of Tunisia was way below sea level. It was once the bottom of the sea, in the Bay of Triton, as described by ancient historian Herodotus. If the desert had been at the bottom of the sea once, surely it could happen again. But why would the French even want to make a sea in the desert? In the late 1800s, France was trying to tighten their grip on their African colonies. They had plans to reshape Africa in their own image. One problem was that too much of what they controlled was desert. If the French could control a large inland sea, they thought it might boost agriculture and commerce. In other words, France's vision of Africa needed more water and more money. The plan soon got underway. The ancient Bay of Triton would be reborn, with water sweeping as far inland as 235 miles from the coast of Tunisia. The plan was to break an isthmus on the coast, sort of like smashing the walls of a dam. Water from the Mediterranean Sea would flow inland via a 120-mile-long canal. Slowly but surely, the Sahara Desert would flood. If the plan had been a success, the new sea would have been about 78 feet deep and 3,100 square miles. That's around double the size of Utah's Great Salt Lake. The plan was an epic failure. Francois undertook 2 expeditions to Africa to plot out the initiative. The first was in 1876 and the other was in 1878. Francois was accompanied by engineers, a doctor, and a general entourage of scientific types and 19th century science groupies. Yes, science groupies are a thing. The expeditions did not yield the expected results. It turned out the land was not below sea level, but significantly above it. Francois tried to save his plan by saying they could build a larger canal. Francois was desperate to create a new sea at all costs. Sadly for him, his plan just wasn't logical. His scientists and engineers turned against him. By 1882, the plot to kill the Sahara Desert was abandoned by the French government. 3 years later, in 1885, Francois caught a fever and died. It was a bad end to a bad plan. Lava tube homes. How would you like to live in a lava tube underneath the desert? There is no electricity, no running water, and it can get a little spooky in the dark. But hey, there's plenty of headroom and you'll never need an air conditioner. The lava tubes I'm talking about are not truly for rent. You can't live in them, but you can visit them. The Jirsan lava tube system is a major tourist attraction in Saudi Arabia. The tunnels were made by bubbling hot lava flows millions of years ago. They go on for more than 5,000 feet, hidden underneath Arabia's Harat Khaibar volcanic field. The last eruption here was in the 7th century, right around the same time the Islamic conquest started. The tubes are not a new discovery, but I do have some new information about them for you. A recent study has shown that human beings were living inside the hollowed-out tubes for 7,000 years, from the Neolithic Age to the Bronze Age. If this is true, it means humans were living inside lava tube caves for longer than any city in human history has ever stood, generation after generation for 700 decades. I don't even think the human brain is supposed to fathom that much time. Archaeologists already knew that ancient humans lived in the deserts of Saudi Arabia, but they were always confused about how the people managed to survive the incredibly hot environment, where the sandy wind feels like a ghost scraping you with sandpaper. It turns out they were living in cool underground shelters. Everybody knows it's colder in the cellar than in the attic. Prehistoric people brought their livestock down into the hollow lava tunnels to escape the heat. The Jirsan lava tube system isn't the only one of its kind. Researchers say there are thousands of volcanic caves underneath Saudi Arabia. There are enough of these natural systems to facilitate an entire civilization of subterranean ghouls. The Roman city under the sand. For almost 1,000 years, a huge Roman city remained lost at the edge of the Sahara Desert, buried underneath the shifting sands. Its name is Timgad. The discovery of the city of Timgad goes back to the 18th century, when European explorers claimed they found bits of a Roman town poking out of the sand in the North African desert. People laughed at them, saying cities buried under the sand are nothing but fairy tales. Those who laughed didn't live long enough to know they were wrong. Modern archaeologists didn't start revealing the city until the 20th century. It wasn't completely exposed until the 1950s. Now Timgad is totally out of the sand, visible in all its glory. Take a look at this aerial photograph by Brian Brake, taken for Life magazine in 1965. All of this was submerged beneath the sand, invisible just 60 years later. There's one major thing you might notice about the photograph. The city was put together in a perfect grid. Take a look at the picture again and notice how each block is separated by roads and avenues. You can see the main thoroughfare leading through the city, branching off into smaller streets and separate neighborhoods. Until Timgad was exposed, nobody believed the Romans had been this skillful when it came to city planning. How old do you think the city is just by looking at it? The first stones were laid in the year 100. Timgad was founded by none other than Emperor Trajan. It was built as a retirement colony for soldiers. When it came to military might, the Romans didn't mess around. They knew they had to take care of their soldiers if they wanted to have the best army in the world. When soldiers retired, typically after military campaigns in North Africa, they went to Timgad with their families. After a few generations, Timgad expanded to have more than 10,000 people living in it. There were the Roman soldiers, local Africans, and Berber mystics. Most of the people who lived in Timgad had likely never been to Rome. Maybe some Roman soldiers had, but their children grew up in Timgad and likely never left. You might be wondering how Rome was able to build a city and then maintain it for centuries when its citizens hadn't even been to the capital, which was more than 1,000 miles away. It was done actually pretty easily. The Romans extended citizenship to the people they conquered in faraway places. In return for unyielding loyalty, local elites and members of government were given a small stake in the full power of the empire. This meant an African ruler in Timgad, even though he had never been to Rome, shared Rome's wealth. The city benefited from the Roman legal system, from urban amenities, and from having legions of Roman soldiers to protect them. With such wealth and protection, how did Timgad end up buried under the Algerian desert? When Rome fell, so did Timgad. In the 5th century, the rampaging Vandals sacked the city, just as they sacked so many other Roman cities. It never recovered after that, and by the end of the 5th century was completely torn apart by rogue Berber tribes. Timgad did experience a brief revival under the Byzantine Empire. It was rebuilt by General Solomon as part of Byzantine North Africa in the 6th century, but fell only decades later to the Muslim conquest. And then the desert began to swallow it. King Solomon's abandoned mines. Let's go back to the Negev desert, the same place where archaeologists found the tombs of the sacred prostitutes. About 5 centuries after those women were entombed, mining found its way to this remote wasteland. What researchers found in the desert is directly connected to the Bible and King Solomon. The Timna Valley was the very first place in the world where humans made copper. This information comes from Mark Kavanaugh, a doctoral student at Tel Aviv University. Mark said that because the Timna Valley is an extension of the Great African Rift, many minerals typically made deep inside the Earth's crust are exposed at the surface. Ancient people didn't have to dig very far to reach copper ore. Since the ore was close to the surface, ancient people were most likely to experiment with it. 7,500 years ago, at the end of the Stone Age, humans started messing around with copper smelting. It took another 1,000 years for humans to learn the secret of alloying tin to the copper, thereby forming hard bronze. From there, technology advanced rapidly. By the 11th century BC, the Negev desert had become home to one of the most profitable copper industries on the planet. Mark and his colleagues wanted to learn more about the copper industry 3,000 years ago. They focused their studies on fragments of charcoal pulled out of ancient furnaces in some ruins near Eilat. The scientists discovered that during the 250 years when the Negev desert's copper industry was booming, the quality of wood used to make charcoal deteriorated. This is because during those years, the desert became unexpectedly populated. Workers in the mines picked clean the desert shrubs, leaving only poor quality wood to use in their furnaces, like trunks of palm trees. Then around 850 BC, things changed. Mining activity ended, everybody left the desert, and the shrubs returned. Take a look at this photo of the Timna Valley near Eilat from Erez Ben Yosef. It looks barren, right? It doesn't look like the site of a major copper mining operation. You can understand why everybody left. Mark Kavanaugh thinks, based on his recent research, that people used up all the wood and couldn't survive in the desert anymore. They had no choice but to abandon their mines because they had completely destroyed the natural environment. You might be wondering how any of this relates to the Bible and King Solomon. Don't worry, I haven't forgotten. The period between the 11th and 9th centuries was when David and his son Solomon supposedly ruled the Israelites. Some scholars don't think David and Solomon existed, yet the Bible says they were real historical kings. And so do a lot of archaeologists. For example, Israel Finkelstein, a professor at Tel Aviv University. He said David and Solomon were living, breathing people who lived around the 10th century BC. The Bible says David and Solomon were filthy rich, but especially Solomon. He was the richest man in the world, all because he owned a series of gold mines. What if King Solomon didn't own gold mines, but rather the copper mines found in the Negev desert? It's possible King Solomon was real, and so was his wealth. But he didn't have gold, he had copper. The story makes a lot of sense when you line up all these dates and myths. The copper mines must have belonged to somebody. Why not a king? This could be the physical proof biblical scholars have been waiting for that the Old Testament kings were legitimate. Thanks for watching! How long do you think you could survive in an inhospitable desert? Let me know in the comments below, and be sure to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and I'll see you next time! Sea monsters in the desert. Far from the royal burial zone at Sahara in Egypt, a team of scientists uncovered the remains of a gigantic creature. It happened back in 2019.
And the scientists weren't at all interested in mummies or buried tombs. They were looking for monsters from a bygone age, and they found them. This monster in the desert lived at a time when Egypt was not a desert at all, as confusing as that may sound. 40 million years ago, this massive marine creature was gliding effortlessly through clean, plastic-free water when Egypt was a shallow marine environment. And even though the beast was so big, it was likely a gentle giant. I'm talking about a prehistoric sea cow called Sirenia, an extinct relative of the manatee. Paleontologists from Cairo University say the ribs and limb bones of a fully grown specimen were found there. This thing would have been like the ancient sea version of a cow for its docile nature and herbivorous appetite. These days, there are 4 living species of manatee spread all the way from the Amazon to West Africa. But the prehistoric version was quite a bit different. It was actually semi-aquatic and still had front and hind limbs 50 million years ago. It took about 10 million years for it to shed its limbs and replace them with fins. And shortly after that, the water began to drain away. The ocean was almost definitely replaced by a forest, which was later replaced by a shrubland or grassland, and then finally a desert. All these years later, the ancient manatee's bones were still lying there on the ground. Cemetery of Flying Reptiles. Scientists in Chile have discovered a very rare cemetery in the middle of the Atacama Desert. The graveyard is filled with the amazingly preserved bones of ancient flying reptiles, which lived over 100 million years ago. By flying reptiles, I mean pterosaurs, the biggest and baddest flying creatures of the dinosaur age. They were a sort of gigantic, terrifying flamingo. Pterosaurs apparently fed by filtering water through their thin teeth, just like how flamingos feed today. But what were all these skeletons doing in the middle of the desert? The Atacama region may be a desolate, scorching wasteland these days, but it was once a much different landscape. There were more animals, there was water, and it wasn't such a lifeless place. Flying reptiles would have had an abundance of food to pick from. These skeletons were found in 2 main cemeteries where there appears to have been some kind of mass death event. According to the lead scientist on the expedition, Jonathan Alarcón, he had been searching for these exact dinosaur remains for years. The discovery of these graveyards was like a revelation, one which surpassed even his greatest hopes. The scientists dug up mostly flat and broken bones, skeletons that had been pummeled by the passing of time. But they also found 3-dimensional bones, hidden unsuspectingly in the desert hills under a thin layer of crystallized rock. Mysterious oasis. In 2014, an oasis appeared in the Tunisian desert. It was quite the sight for the desert locals who couldn't believe their eyes. In the middle of an otherwise barren stretch of sand, there was a shimmering blue lake as if it had been sent from heaven above. Nobody in the region knew where it came from, but they didn't care. Hundreds of locals swarmed the unexpected oasis and started swimming. It was originally discovered first by a couple of shepherds wandering through the wasteland, and since the temperature was well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, it quickly became a hit with the locals. But you can't trust everything you find in the desert. There were some serious concerns that this random lake of seemingly crystal water was polluted by the local phosphate mining industry. It was believed that carcinogenic materials had seeped into the water. In the end, nobody died, and we never did get an explanation for how a lake appeared overnight in the desert. Scientists say it may have been groundwater released by seismic activity, pushed up to the surface. However, we don't know for sure. Tombos. Tombos is a curious archaeological site in the desert near the Nile River in northern Sudan. It consists of circular mounds of rock that look like ordinary formations amongst the desert landscape. But in reality, Tombos is an ancient underground burial site. The tombs were carved out of the ground around the year 2500 BC. They were made by the native inhabitants of Nubia, ancient Egypt's lesser-known neighbor to the south. Unfortunately, the deeper history of Africa is usually eclipsed by the rise of Egypt. The global fascination with Egyptian pyramids and mummies has drowned out the rest of the old societies in the region. There were many different civilizations that rose at the same time along the Nile River Valley and wielded major power. One of these was the Kingdom of Kush, but the Egyptians didn't really like having a powerful neighbor to the south, and so they frequently went to war. Tombos was actually an Egyptian colonial site during the New Kingdom. The Egyptians were trying to get a foothold in Nubia to carve a small chunk of it out for themselves by slowly spreading their people into the land around 1200 BC. While it worked briefly, they would ultimately lose control of the region. However, just by having a small colonial site here, the Egyptians left a cultural mark. The tombs at Tombos were done in typical Egyptian fashion, and pyramids even once stood in the area as smaller copies of the Great Pyramids farther north. Fighting superbugs. The Gobi Desert meets the Tibetan Plateau in northern China to create one of the most surreal landscapes in the world. Vast sand dunes, mountains of jagged rock, and countless miles of nothing. The temperatures can sink well below freezing in the winter, and in the summer and the blistering sun, it can be hot enough to melt your skin. It's here in this desert region where scientists are hunting for organisms that they hope to use medicinally. These desert organisms may just be helping scientists to treat antibiotic-resistant bacteria, thereby saving roughly 1 million lives a year. This remote desert holds the key to new antibiotics which bacteria has yet to develop a resistance to. One of the scientists participating in the hunt is Paul Dyson from Swansea University Medical School. Paul and his team have already discovered one species of bacteria that could change medicine for good. In 2013, the scientists managed to isolate a previously unknown type of Streptomyces bacteria in the Gobi Desert. They sequenced the bacterium's genome and found it to be a kind of super species, producing antibiotics to kill other bacteria and growing much faster than normal. This is the kind of bacteria which could be used in RNA vaccines. Fun fact, Streptomyces is also what gives soil its earthy dirt smell. It takes a lot of testing to get from bacteria to vaccine, as we can tell by just how old the discovery is. But it's pretty fascinating to think that lying in a big chunk of sand somewhere could be the cure to the next pandemic. Comet glass. A discovery of mysterious glass takes us back to Chile's Atacama Desert. Not far from where scientists recently discovered a graveyard of prehistoric flying lizards, scientists discovered bits of twisted glass thrown across the surface of the sand. They believe this mysterious glass in the desert came from a massive comet that exploded in the Earth's atmosphere. The catastrophic event happened about 12,000 years ago. The force of the explosion would have produced intense tornado winds and such unimaginable heat that the desert sand was scorched. The sand was heated to temperatures so hot that it was transformed as if by magic into silicate glass. The discovery of this glass was made about 10 years ago, but it wasn't until recently that scientists realized what it was. At first, they had been stumped by the chunks of dark green and black glass found across a 47-mile stretch of desert. Some of these chunks of glass were about the size of a pizza box. Some researchers thought the sand had been turned into glass from grass fires, while some thought fireballs in the atmosphere. Nobody wanted to believe that a comet could have caused such an explosion, not until the evidence was indisputable. This would have been like a nuclear bomb going off, the heat so intense that if a city had been here, everyone in it would have most likely been vaporized. A lost civilization. In the United Arab Emirates, scientists have discovered the leftover traces of an ancient civilization that once lived in the desert. Scientists say the mysterious civilization prospered here 12,000 years ago. At the same time, an explosion was turning sand to glass in South America. The scientists made this discovery using the newest technology available to them at Khalifa University in Abu Dhabi. They used satellite remote sensing observations to look at the remnants of objects buried under the earth. They concentrated on the area surrounding already known archaeological sites. Basically, they figured that the society would have built their stuff close together, and they were 100% correct. One of the biggest discoveries was made near the archaeological site of Saruq al-Hadid, which was found back in 2002. It's deep in the desert at the southern borders of the Dubai Emirate, and was used as a metal-producing factory in the Iron Age. It likely functioned between 1300 and 800 BC. Although scientists have found treasures from the Stone Age 9,000 years before the metal factory, it was likely the Iron Age where the culture peaked. Now we have even more sites in the surrounding desert. It looks like there was really a massive civilization spread all across the UAE, and yet nobody knows who they were. They could obviously make tools, they practiced advanced industrial manufacturing, and almost all their greatest achievements have since been swallowed by the merciless desert. The biggest diamond. Miners in the Angolan desert have just discovered something beyond precious. According to the Lucapa Diamond Company, they have mined the largest pink diamond found in 300 years. That makes it one of the biggest diamonds of all time, an extraordinarily rare 170-carat pure chunk of diamond. The Australian mining company has named the precious gem the Lulo Rosa. It was found in the northeastern region of Angola, where life is scarce and the environment is harsh, but diamonds are plentiful. It's a Type 2A diamond, which is one of the rarest and purest of all naturally developed stones. It was such a historic find that even the Angolan government shared the exciting news. And although we don't actually know the market value of the pink diamond just yet, it's already being set up for sale. Judging on its size, comparable to a baseball, and previous sales like the 2017 Pink Star diamond that sold for over $7 million, it will most likely fetch a small fortune. The Roswell anniversary. July 8, 2022 was the 75th anniversary of one of the biggest mysteries to ever come out of a desert. 75 years ago, a spaceship may or may not have been found crash-landed in the shrub-spotted wastes of New Mexico. It was on July 8, 1947 that the story appeared in the Roswell Daily Record. The caption was, "RAAF captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region." And although the newspaper didn't offer enough specifics to paint a clear picture of what happened, the nation was intrigued. It was implied that a ship piloted by extraterrestrials had just landed in America. The news report said that the 509th Bombardment Group at the Roswell Army Airfield retrieved the mysterious instrument and then took it to their headquarters. A day after the first story, there was a follow-up stating that the object was nothing but a high-altitude weather balloon, and that they had been mistaken about the flying saucer. Even though the case seemed to be open and shut in just 24 hours, we are still talking about it all these years later. What we know is that some kind of wreckage was discovered by a rancher named Mac Brazel on his property. The entire region was undergoing a wave of mysterious sightings. People had been seeing flying saucers nearly every night. Pilot Kenneth Arnold even reported seeing strange flying objects as he piloted over Mount Rainier in Washington state. Mac Brazel contacted the authorities about the wreckage he had discovered on his property, and this led to the July 8th news story. But whether these scraps of metal found really belonged to a weather balloon or a flying saucer, we still don't know. California stone circles. To this very day, archaeologists are baffled by a group of mysterious circle-shaped earthworks in the Southern California desert. The ancient earthworks can be found in the Anza Borrego Desert State Park, and they have been there for at least 3,000 years. The earthworks aren't that large, made up of simple stone circles just big enough for someone to lay down inside of them. And even though they've been studied repeatedly, scientists still can't agree on what they were used for. Some have suggested they could have had something to do with cooking, maybe shelter, or even ceremonial activity. Another interesting theory is that these stone circles were left behind by travelers many thousands of years before Europeans ever arrived in North America. They may have been used as temporary shelters, primitive rock huts where the travelers could seek a reprieve from the sun. If they were temporary shelters, they may have been used by a migrating group of early humans trying to find the best place to settle. But at the end of the day, it's all just speculation. Archaeologists haven't found any artifacts linked to the stone circles. They don't know who built them, and they're not even entirely sure of the age. These circles are definitely at least 3,000 years old, but could date as far back as 10,000 years. Discoveries in Nazareth. A new archaeological discovery in Nazareth has revealed some interesting secrets about the past. You may remember Nazareth as the place where Jesus grew up. New research has shown that Nazareth was substantially bigger than what historians believed. It was generally thought that Nazareth was just a small village, but it was likely a huge town sprawled out in the middle of the desert. And because it was so big, the citizens of Nazareth would have been a lot more involved in the politics of the day. Researchers say the people here were probably extremely conservative and very much anti-Roman. You might be wondering how any of this is interesting. Well, it all pertains to Jesus and his rise as the Son of God. British archaeologist Ken Dark says the Jewish people living in Nazareth abided by the rules of their religion much more strictly than the surrounding cities. For example, excavation in ancient agricultural land has shown that the inhabitants of Nazareth never used human excrement to fertilize their fields, even though their neighbors in the town of Sepphoris, just 4 miles away, did. That's because it was considered forbidden in the Jewish religion. There is also proof of certain ceramics and objects that were religiously pure, unlike the neighboring town from the same time period. Sepphoris was heavily influenced by Greek and Roman culture, but not Nazareth. All the evidence points to the city of Nazareth being wildly conservative and the home of several revolts against the Romans. Anti-Roman rebels created a sizable network of underground hiding places and tunnels underneath the town. As researcher David Keyes says, religious Jews saw Roman and Greek influence as a serious and direct threat to their faith. This environment and political climate clearly would have shaped Jesus' views of the world. Stone altar. In the desert city of Ataroth, located in Jordan, an ancient stone altar has been discovered. The altar dates back 2,800 years and bears 2 nearly indecipherable inscriptions. The words were written in the Moabite language, with the numbers being written in hieratic Egyptian. The altar itself dates back to a time after Mesha, king of Moab, rebelled against the kingdom of Israel. In the Hebrew Bible, the rebellion is mentioned as a historical event, but up until now, there has been absolutely no proof that it happened. The Bible says that before the rebellion, Moab was forced to pay tribute to Israel in the form of thousands of fresh lambs and an obscene amount of wool. This was enough to cause Moab to rise up, and they quickly conquered Ataroth and killed most of the city's inhabitants. One of the inscriptions on this ancient altar describes the plunder of Ataroth after the city was defeated. It appears that the bronze looted from the city was presented as an offering and then recorded on the altar. The second inscription is a little more mysterious. It states that 4,000 foreign men were scattered and abandoned, while the last part could only be deciphered as the desolate city. It's all quite cryptic. But one thing is certain, this archaeological evidence is proof that another story from the Bible is rooted in reality. New desert spider. In the brutally hot and dry wasteland of India's Thar Desert, a new species of spider has been found. It's a jumping spider, an arachnid that can literally leap off the ground and latch onto your face. They are cute or terrifying, depending on your thoughts about spiders. They live in the desert, usually perched on blades of grass. This discovery was made in the Thar Desert National Park Wildlife Sanctuary, named Pseudomogris sudhi after an Indian zoologist. It's a totally new species which belongs to the larger family of Saltacidae. In total, there are over 600 different genera of these jumping spiders, with 3 new ones discovered in India back in 2021. 35 species of this particular genus have been discovered across the globe. Luckily, you don't need to be worried about ever coming across one of these spiders unless you happen to be crawling around in the scrubland of the Thar Desert. This spider is pale, with sandy brown limbs, huge fangs, and markings of black and dark red. We don't know exactly how far it can jump, but almost certainly high enough to freak you out. Dinosaurs in the Sahara. Experts have found yet another fantastic dinosaur that lived in the Sahara Desert 100 million years ago. The discovery was made by a team of Egyptian and American researchers who say the dinosaur was once a powerful meat eater. This ferocious predator is named Abelisauridae, and it grew to an almost unbelievable 36 feet in length. It wasn't just long, but extremely heavy as well, weighing about 3,000 kilograms. This is just one more monstrous beast added to the already long list of predators living in the Sahara back in the day. Researchers believe the prehistoric Sahara Desert is one of the most dangerous places that has ever existed. While we don't know how so many gigantic predators lived in such close proximity, scientists think it had something to do with specialized prey. In other words, a whole bunch of carnivorous dinosaurs lived in relative harmony because they each preyed on a different kind of victim. It made life for small animals a nightmare. The evidence of this dinosaur was discovered thanks to students at Ohio University, who recovered its bones in Egypt. It's actually an unnamed species of the Abelisaurid group, and the first of its kind. It lived approximately 98 million years ago at a time when the western desert of Egypt, part of the Sahara, wasn't nearly as dry and inhospitable as it is now. So many dinosaurs have been found here that researchers are convinced this was actually a rainforest, or at least a lush jungle-type environment. The sheer number of predators suggests a thriving ecosystem, from the microorganisms to the carnivores. It's shoutout time! Big thank you to Dominic Adrianse and Christy Gibson Cormier for supporting this channel. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already to join the Origins Explained family. Kartchner Caverns. In the southern desert of Arizona, two men discovered an underground wonder in the 1970s. As far as the story goes, two friends from college who studied in Tucson went out on a weekend excursion to look for an underground cave. What they ended up finding was Kartchner Caverns, subterranean chambers which formed hundreds of millions of years ago. Arizona was once fully submerged underwater. As the water receded, it left a limestone layer underneath. And then, over the next 330 million years, that limestone turned into the Whetstone Mountains, and it also eroded and dissolved to create these passages underground. Then, over a span of about 200,000 years, minerals were carried by water under the ground, where they filtered to create beautiful formations in a variety of vivid colors. The end result is what we see today. In Kartchner Caverns' big room, there is the most extensive formation in the world of something called brushite moon milk, incredibly colored stalagmites and stalactites. The caverns are also home to over 1,500 bats in the summer. Have you been there? Let me know in the comments below. The last king of Babylon. A mysterious carving was discovered deep in the desert of northern Saudi Arabia. The carving depicts the very last king of Babylon, created 2,550 years ago. It also has an inscription explaining who this great ruler is. The carving was made in the 6th century BC to depict the Babylonian ruler Nabonidus. It was found by archaeologists from the Saudi Commission for Tourism and National Heritage, engraved on a basalt stone in the Hale region. There are approximately 26 lines of ancient cuneiform script on it, making it the longest cuneiform inscription found in the region. The Babylonian king can be seen standing with a scepter in one hand and 4 very important symbols etched in front of him. There is a crescent moon, a sun, a snake, and a flower. Scholars believe the images hold some kind of religious significance, but haven't been able to actually identify that significance yet. They could be linked to ancient Mesopotamian deities, representing gods like Ishtar of the stars, the sun god Shamash, and the moon deity Sin. What we do know is that Nabonidus ruled Babylon from between the years 556 and 539 BC, which was terrible luck because this is when the kingdom fell to Persia. Babylon had stretched all the way from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea, and Nabonidus had been responsible for conquering huge parts of Saudi Arabia. Just 4 years later, he was forced into exile north of El Hait, and Babylon was brought to its knees. Aside from the single basalt rock with the carving on it, there are other mysterious archaeological sites found in this desert area. There are ruins of fortresses, broken water installations that once brought crops to the people of Al Hait, known as Fadak in ancient times, and even ancient examples of rock art. Sand that breathes. In a bizarre new discovery, researchers have learned that desert landscapes are not quite as barren and lifeless as they may appear. Not only can the sand dunes of the desert grow and move and even interact with one another, but they can also breathe. Researchers used a sensitive probe to reveal that sand dunes quite literally inhale and exhale water vapor. They did this by plunging their instrument into a sand dune in the Qatar desert. The instrument scanned the temperature, the radiation, and the moisture. It turns out that sand dunes inhale hard when it's dry, and that the wind sweeps off the top layer of sand to create waves of humidity that push downward along the dunes. It all comes down to water vapor. Water vapor percolates between grains of sand like pores on the skin of the sand dunes. When the wind blows, these pores are opened and the pressure changes, injecting air into the pores and squirting out tiny invisible puffs of moisture. Mechanical engineer Michel Luge explained it quite simply, saying the sand is breathing just like any other organism breathes. Even when no liquid is available, the sand dunes make their own moisture. And this breathing is probably what helps microbes stay alive in the sand. The wonders of the Arabian Desert. The Arabian Desert is home to so many magical ruins and forgotten pieces of history that you could spend weeks exploring them all. One of the most fascinating, perhaps, is in Abu Dhabi, a place called Bida bint Saad. It's an ancient caravan site that once housed a great community of farmers, extending all the way north to the edge of the Arabian Peninsula. The small settlement used irrigation systems to bring life to the desert and flourished for at least 5,000 years. Near the ancient caravan hub, where traders from all over the world came to sell their goods, there are other places of interest, like Bronze Age tombs from 5,000 years ago, and Garn bint Saad. Garn bint Saad is a rock about 120 feet tall that towers over the landscape. There are stone tombs embedded in the top, where the bones of the elite members of the desert societies in Abu Dhabi were once buried. Another fantastic place in the Arabian Desert is the Hili Archaeological Park. The site dates back to about 3,200 BC, to a time when human beings lived in rock-built huts, kind of like giant stone igloos. This is the largest collection of tombs and buildings in the United Arab Emirates from the Bronze Age. Archaeologists have found villages, entire burial grounds, and broken agricultural infrastructure from the an-Nar period. Ancient home of Abraham. British archaeologists recently uncovered a sprawling complex near the ancient Sumerian city of Ur in the desert of South Iraq. The structure is about 4,000 years old and had likely served as the administrative center for the powerful city of Ur, arguably one of the greatest cities to ever be built by human hands, and certainly the first true metropolis to ever grace the planet. But it's also quite interesting because researchers say this particular structure was functional around the time when the biblical Abraham lived in the city, just before, according to the Bible, he left for Canaan. Stuart Campbell from Manchester University called this sprawling complex a breathtaking find. It's unusually large, over 260 feet on both sides, meaning it was likely one of the largest buildings in the city. Researchers believe it was used for administrative purposes, or it could have had religious connections. Whatever the case, it almost certainly played a major role in the politics of Ur. To put it into perspective, it's almost as if archaeologists have found the Supreme Court building of ancient Mesopotamia. The biggest mystery right now is trying to figure out why it was erected 12 miles from the actual capital of Sumer. Forgotten mosque. Archaeologists in the Israeli desert have discovered the ruins of one of the oldest mosques in the world. The ruins are 1,200 years old, located in the Negev desert. The discovery came during the construction of a new neighborhood. Builders uncovered a square room facing in the direction of Mecca. As you might already know, mosques are always designed to face Mecca. It features a small niche where men have prayed, and it could have held about a dozen worshippers at one time. It wasn't a very large building, but it was one of the first. Researchers discovered a luxurious estate building not very far away. This suggests the mosque was used by elite members of society as they practiced their religion. Islam arrived in Israel, specifically in the Negev desert region, extremely early in its spread. In the 7th century BC, about 1,300 years ago, a major transition started to take place as people of both Christian and Jewish faith began converting to Islam. It took a little longer for Islam to sweep across much of the rest of the world, first going through the Middle East and North Africa, but Israel was one of the very first places. And so it's no surprise to see that one of the oldest mosques ever built is still here in the sand, lying in ruins. Which ancient desert ruins would you love to explore for yourself? Let me know in the comments below, and thanks for watching! Be sure to subscribe and come back soon for more videos like these. Bye!